So I've had an interest in color, especially in the production of images, for quite a long time. As you know, I'm not an image maker. And quite some years ago, I started working with James Langdon to try and find ways of producing images that would talk about the work that are not installation photography. This is quite difficult, actually, to do, because I often found that when you're talking about dynamic environments, installations that change, photography is not always the most appropriate medium, and that's conventional photography, right? One print of one thing in time. We started working with color separation, and James Langdon developed this graphic language through the artist-run space that we co-founded, Eastside Projects, using color separation to talk about time. So using the CMYK process, instead of printing all four colors in one go, but adding space in between each color in order to have images that are harder to read, but that actually talk about an expanse of time rather than an instant. And this exercise allowed us to, on the one hand, have a new graphic language to talk about work in a different way, and on the other hand, have almost like a field on which to continue this research on color, and also research on what it means to photograph things and to try and make the experience of something present rather than the representation of it, which is essentially one of the most important things, I think, for the communication of my work. One of the most important things that I'm interested in, this thing like presence versus representation. More recently, these color experimentations, I'm talking about a dialogue over more than 15 years. So more recently, these experimentations have taken the shape of we're sort of expanding from the CMYK process, using spot colors, intervening within the printing presses. Like, for example, the print Zanzibar is really an intervention within the printing process to produce a completely different type of image, in which the original object is hardly recognizable, actually. And this led me at some point in the last 2 years, I think, to start wondering whether it was possible to produce images in a completely different way, so not starting from a photograph at all, but thinking of the photographic process as a process of production in and of itself. It's not such an easy thing to do, so one of the clues that I had was an interest in cephalopods and octopus, that at some point I started looking at. I don't actually even remember why. I think it was through a film by Jean Painlevé, The Octopus in Love, that I watched some years ago. And my partner did quite some research on octopus, and at some point I realized that the capacity that the octopus skin has to produce color for camouflage, for dreaming, for joy, for many kinds of expression, was somehow talking to what I was looking for, meaning that they are images and they are colors. They're not reproductions, they're not illusions of purple or green, they're actual colors that reflect a state of mind, a state of emotion. And I looked at research into printing reproduction, research on the technology around printing, and it looks like this is actually the technology that people are looking at around the world. Labs in the United States trying to find ways of having stable color production in relationship to fabric especially, but also on paper, are looking at octopuses and cephalopods as ways, technologies that can point to the invention of new technologies towards the future. So the CMYK will not exist at some point, and this process will be entirely reinvented. What I was looking for was a certain capacity of relating to context, in this kind of divorce between subject and object, between context and object. I think there's a modernist crisis, really, in the inability to relate to one's environment. And again, the animal world has some capacity to point towards a way forward. The octopus becomes its surrounding, it becomes a piece of coral, it becomes a cave, right? It's really the becoming animal that comes also from a Deleuze-Guattari sort of, emancipatory movement away from a definition of identity towards the capacity to be many things and transform into many things. And this study I decided to do through color. So to think, is it possible that I would learn to make images in a similar way? What can I learn from a cephalopod and how can I treat color as a formation rather than as an illusion or a reproduction. I replicated in my studio the experiments of a chemist called Ferdinand Runge, who by creating simple reactions between chemicals was able to develop the first synthetic blue, meaning the first color blue that would be stable and would be produced in a way that it always resulted in the same color, so it could be used to dye fabric. Dye, ink, another link with cephalopods. So I put this material, hundreds of chemical experiments of like blobs on paper of different shades of blue and pink and brown. I put these experiments in relationship to a sort of study, a summary of my understanding of how cephalopod skin is actually able, with our understanding today, is actually able to produce colors. So trying to break it down into simple instructions, or at least simple operations, something that I gave to James Langdon, who then built a machine. That's the best way I have to explain it. A sort of AI that would be able to follow the instructions and therefore learn to produce images like a cephalopod does, or at least trying to mimic the mimicker in the best way possible. The results were these very large-scale kind of color fields. They interestingly really look like paintings, which for me was quite surprising because, as I said earlier, I'm really not an image maker. I've never made paintings. And the scale of them allows me to deal with the scale of environment. So you're always in the work. You're not looking at it from a position of distance, but you're always somehow wrapped in it. These images or surfaces or environments I use to wrap and display the installation in, and I commissioned Hannah Catherine Jones to give them a sound, to give them a soundtrack, to give them a soul in some ways, to find a way of animating this material, as music is able to do, of course. The installation hosts the work of many others. Along the way, I found artists, friends, voices, research that was absolutely essential and that spoke to the research in a way that my work alone could not. And those are included in the installation in a way that I think is able to talk through a multitude of voices somehow, so that it creates quite recent and serious research, as well as an incredibly immersive, central and quite precise aesthetic experience of an installation.